If you've looked at EV prices lately, especially used ones, you're probably having the same reaction a lot of people are having. Why would I buy this new when there's a lightly used one sitting right there for dramatically less money? And what's strange is that many of these used EVs still just feel new. I mean, you get in them and the experience really isn't that different from the new one sitting on the showroom floor. They're still quick, the software still feels modern, and the interiors don't feel dated. A lot of these cars barely even have miles on them yet. So now some people are starting to ask a very reasonable question. Why am I paying full price for this? I think that question is becoming more common because EVs are changing how people think about car ownership itself, especially when buyers start comparing new versus used. So in this video, I want to talk through why EV depreciation feels so unusual right now compared to gasoline cars, why some buyers are reconsidering whether buying new even makes sense, and why the used EV market may end up becoming one of the most interesting parts of EV ownership over the next several years. For decades, most people have had a pretty intuitive understanding of how cars depreciated. You bought a new car, it lost value most aggressively in the first few years, and eventually things just settled down. But even as the car aged, it still felt mostly like the same category of product. A 7-year-old gasoline SUV still fundamentally felt like an SUV. Maybe the technology looked older and the styling aged a little bit, but the ownership psychology itself was relatively stable. EVs can feel a bit different, and I think part of that reason is that EVs occupy this strange middle ground between durable machine and evolving technology product. It changes how buyers think about ownership in the first place. People aren't just evaluating mileage and reliability anymore. Now they're also thinking about charging standards, battery technology, software updates, range improvements, even tax incentives, and whether the vehicle might suddenly feel outdated faster than expected. And once buyers start feeling uncertainty around how fast a car will become outdated, depreciation accelerates fairly quickly. Now, obviously, not every EV depreciates the same way. Some are holding value reasonably well, while others have dropped surprisingly fast. But there are a few things all happening at once. The first is that new EV pricing itself has become unstable. Take Tesla, probably the clearest example of fluctuating new car pricing. When manufacturers aggressively cut prices on new vehicles, it immediately affects the used car market because buyers suddenly start looking at used pricing differently too. I mean, think about it. If the new one suddenly got cheaper, why would you still pay almost new pricing for the used one? And that's before you even layer in incentives on top of all this. Tax credits, lease deals, and manufacturer discounts all pretty quickly change the original MSRP, and it stops meaning much at all. So MSRP stops being a clean reference point, and that makes your used pricing feel unstable too. And then there's the pace of improvement, or at least the perception that things are improving very quickly. Even though modern EVs are already very good, buyers still feel like the category is evolving rapidly. Charging speeds improve, range improves, software evolves, and battery discussions never really stop. Manufacturers continue introducing new platforms at a pretty aggressive pace, and the software side of this changes buyer psychology too. A modern EV may continue receiving over-the-air updates long after it's sold, so the used version of the vehicle may actually benefit from some of the same software enhancements and feature improvements as the new one. That creates a really unusual ownership dynamic because the used car doesn't always feel frozen in time the way older vehicles often did. So even if the vehicle itself is excellent, buyers still worry they may be overpaying for something that could suddenly feel technologically behind. And honestly, this is where EVs begin behaving more like technology products than traditional mechanical products. What makes the market feel unusual is that many used EVs don't actually feel old. That's really the disconnect buyers are wrestling with right now. A lightly used EV often feels fast, modern, and technologically current. In many cases, it still has years of battery warranty remaining, it still supports modern charging infrastructure, and it still feels remarkably similar to the new version sitting on the lot. So buyers increasingly look at these cars and realize that maybe letting the first owner absorb the steepest depreciation is actually the smarter move. And for a lot of people, it probably is. especially if your driving habits are predictable, you charge at home most of the time, and you aren't constantly chasing the newest battery platform every few years. Because once you stop thinking about EVs as experimental must upgrade products, the value proposition of used EVs starts becoming incredibly compelling. I also think leasing changed EV buyer psychology more than people realize. A lot of buyers entered the EV market through leases because the category itself still felt uncertain. Battery longevity felt unknown, and charging infrastructure was evolving pretty quickly. Incentives kept changing, and technology cycles felt faster than what people were used to with traditional cars. So, leasing created emotional distance from all of that uncertainty. But once large numbers of people started leasing EVs, something else happened too. The used market began filling with these relatively new off-lease vehicles, which increased supply and put even more pressure on used prices. And leasing isn't the only source of supply here. Rental companies also bought large numbers of EVs over the last several years, and many of those vehicles eventually started flowing into the used market too. So now you have off-lease EVs, former rental EVs, manufacturer price cuts, and incentives all converging at the same time, which puts even more downward pressure on used pricing. And from the perspective of the second owner, that can actually become a huge advantage. Because now you suddenly have a modern EV entering the used market at prices that honestly would have seemed impossible only a few years ago. And buyers are gradually becoming less afraid of used EV ownership in general. Early EV conversations were dominated by uncertainty. Nearly every discussion eventually turned into battery anxiety, charging fears, replacement cost, or concerns about long-term ownership. But now we have enough real-world experience that many buyers are realizing modern EV batteries often hold up far better than people originally expected. That obviously doesn't make every used EV automatically a great purchase, but it does make the category itself feel much more understandable and much less mysterious than it did several years ago. And as buyers become more comfortable with used EV ownership, the market naturally starts behaving differently too. So the question becomes, should you buy new or used? Honestly, I think that depends less on whether EVs are good or bad and more on what kind of buyer you are. If you always want the newest charging speeds, the newest battery platform, the latest software experience, and the latest hardware improvements, then buying new or leasing may still make complete sense for you. But if your goal is simply to own a very modern feeling vehicle with low operating costs, good daily usability, and strong overall value, used EVs are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. This is especially the case because many of them still just don't feel really old yet. And I think that's the psychological tension underneath this whole market right now. These vehicles often depreciate rapidly without actually feeling meaningfully outdated in everyday use. And for a car, that's unusual. For decades, cars depreciated mostly like machines. The process felt mechanical, gradual, and relatively predictable. But EVs increasingly depreciate partly like technology products too. And I think buyers are still learning how to emotionally price that reality. Once software, charging ecosystems, incentives, and rapid platform iteration become part of ownership, the psychology around buying and keeping a vehicle starts changing too, not necessarily for the worse, but very differently. And that difference may end up creating some genuinely incredible opportunities for used EV buyers over the next several years. If you're shopping for a used EV, one of the biggest mistakes buyers still make is focusing almost entirely on battery degradation percentages while ignoring the broader ownership experience of the vehicle itself. I actually did an entire video on that topic because I think a lot of buyers are focusing on the wrong number. So if you're thinking seriously about buying a used EV, that's probably the next video you should watch. This is Wrench and Reason, where we explain how modern cars actually work. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.